This upcoming weekend, October 16th and 17th, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. October 2001, the ship first opened as a museum. So all 5 of our videos this week are going to be on museum-related topics. Today's video on what happens to ships that aren't turned into museums. Tomorrow we've got a video on what you just got a museum ship, great. What the heck do you do now? We've got a video on the different core documents that a museum needs to focus on for making their plans. We've got a video on what the future holds for museum ships. And finally, we've got a video talking about the history of Battleship New Jersey over the 20 years that it was run as a museum, and some of our successes and some of the issues we've had. So if you're interested in museums, you work for another museum, maybe this content will be interesting for you. Otherwise, we're going to talk about some cool stuff that's happening around the museum, so you should probably watch these anyway.
Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. We recently received news that we've been expecting to get for a long time, that the last 2 conventionally powered supercarriers, USS Kitty Hawk and USS John F. Kennedy, are going to be sold for scrap. This has raised a lot of discussion online and in other circles because they were sold for just 1 penny each. And that's pretty cheap for a 60 or 70,000 ton supercarrier. So let's talk about that deal a little bit. It seems like there are a ton of misconceptions out there that I think it's worth addressing and continuing the conversation here on our YouTube channel. So, first off, there have been several museum groups that have tried to get Kennedy, Kitty Hawk, and the other supercarriers that have already all been scrapped, the other conventionally powered ones. And none of those groups have successfully completed the process that NAVSEA has in place for new groups to take over ships. So Kennedy, at the very least, I know the most about her because I've been on board her, and she's been docked here at the Philadelphia Navy Yard for well over a decade at this point. Kennedy was on donation hold for a number of years while these museum organizations, or prospective museum organizations, tried to raise the money to acquire her. And so this brings up the question, the Navy just sold her for a penny. How could this museum group not have raised the money to acquire her? And we're going to get to that. However, about 3 years ago now, after the deadline had passed for these groups to raise the money, the Navy removed Kennedy from donation hold and opened both Kennedy and Kitty Hawk for stripping. This would have been in September 2018 that museum ships were allowed to strip Kennedy, roughly the same time for Kitty Hawk. Kitty Hawk was in Bremerton on the west coast. Kennedy was here in Philadelphia on the east coast. So this fits with the Navy's reserve plans where they divide their ships up between the coasts. So they've got backup ships all over the place just in case. We've talked about this in a number of other videos. First, the big Navy, the active Navy, gets to come in and strip parts they need. Next, other navies would be allowed to come in and take parts they need. I'm not sure if this was the case for the supercarriers because nobody else operates ships like that. It's one thing, like earlier this year when we stripped parts off of the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates, other navies operate them, and so they were allowed to come and take parts too. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. And then finally, museum ships like Battleship New Jersey are allowed to come and take parts off. And the ship was open for about a week, and a number of Battleship New Jersey staff and volunteers were allowed to go over and take parts off. And those parts came in a variety of flavors. Here's one of them right here in Battleship New Jersey's medical spaces. This backboard or reed sleeve says USS John F. Kennedy, CV-67, right on it. This is one of 2 that we were able to grab from her medical spaces, and if you've ever gotten the chance to tour New Jersey, you know that our medical spaces are some of the best restored and interpreted parts of the ship. So a lot of stuff that we strip are pieces like these that make the ship seem more alive when we store them around the room or on empty racks, that sort of stuff. Some things that we strip are like the medical lights overhead. Battleship New Jersey was missing many of hers, and so we've stripped these off of other ships, and we even got some off of Kennedy. And you can see that the ones that we have here in this examination room are a mixed match. Things that we've stripped over the years, and some of them may even be original. And then other things are things that we need to keep the ship going. So for example, the blowers in our fan control units, the FCUs, the motors that control our air conditioning systems, those go down all the time. And we've already stripped motors out of the non-museum parts of the ship to keep the tour route air conditioning going. And so now we've got to get these off of other ships when they're open for stripping, which usually happens about once a year or so. So, Kennedy is not going to be saved as a museum. Kitty Hawk is not going to be saved as a museum. But parts from them are going to keep other museum ships alive. I know the Battleship Wisconsin, the aircraft carrier Intrepid, the destroyer escort Slater, and a number of other museums, including Battleship New Jersey, got to partake in these strip trips and open houses to get parts. So these ships will live on in the existing museum ships. What's devastating about this deal, one of the things that has people talking the most, is these are the last two conventionally powered supercarriers. It is extremely unlikely that any nuclear-powered ships will be turned into museums. The Nautilus had to be heavily cut up to have her reactors removed, and then a new pressure hull facsimile had to be built around it. So only about half of that ship is tourable as a museum, and half of it's relatively empty shell because they had to cut out the reactor. You can sort of do that with a submarine, especially if it's going to be a one-off thing. But with an aircraft carrier, cutting through a dozen, some of them armored decks, to get to your reactor compartments, remove that, and then put them back in place, well, that's going to cost a huge amount of money. It's why the massively historically significant aircraft carrier Enterprise CVN-65 is being scrapped instead of being preserved. So, if potential museum organizations cannot raise the money to save a conventionally powered carrier, there's no way they can raise the money to save and maintain a nuclear carrier and gut a large part of the ship. So, the fact that Kitty Hawk and Kennedy are both being sold to the scrappers means that we are never going to see a supercarrier museum. And many people, myself included, are disappointed by that because supercarriers are the most American warship. Nobody else operates true supercarriers. Other people's carriers are just smaller. They operate minuscule air groups. Supercarriers are the American naval weapon of the 20th century and the American power projection weapon. And whether you think that that's well-deserved or not, that is what people think about when they think about the U.S. Navy these days. So the fact that we're not saving one of these is hugely disappointing to a lot of people. And with these two ships being sold for scrap, it means that there won't be any saved. So, if the Navy is just selling these for a penny, how come a museum can't buy them? So, this is not uncommon, especially for the supercarriers to be sold for $1 or a penny or something ridiculously cheap. The scrappers are going to lose money salvaging these ships. There's 60 or 70,000 tons of steel and other scrappable metals in these ships. How are they losing money? Well, they've got to do a tremendous amount of remediation for things like lead, PCB, and asbestos, and that's going to cost a huge amount of money. Furthermore, parts of the aircraft carrier Kennedy are still classified, so they have to get security clearance for their staff that are going to be breaking her up. So that's not going to be cheap or easy either. Really, this is a favor that the company is doing for the U.S. government. And maybe because they're doing this favor and probably losing a little bit of money on scrapping the ship, or certainly not making any huge amount, then maybe they'll be able to parlay that into future scrapping on ships that aren't nearly as contaminated as these ships are. So, I heard this question also. Why doesn't a museum ship buy the ship for a penny, or why doesn't the Navy sell this ship for a penny to a museum? The museum ship takes off everything it can get and then sells it to the scrapper for more money. You can't just sell these ships to anyone, particularly if they're still classified. They have a lot of systems on them in common with the modern or still contemporary aircraft carriers that are our frontline assets. So we can't just sell these to India for them to pull up on the beach and scrap like a number of other ships are, where they don't worry about the PCBs and the lead and the other things. They've got to go to American scrappers with certain clearances, and so NAVSEA cannot just sell them to anyone, not to a museum, not to a foreign company, no one. They've got to go to specifically qualified American scrapping companies. What is the process going to look like for these ships going forward now? So the Navy's been getting ready for this for years. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that these ships are being scrapped. They've gone through the proper process. They've given museum organizations the time to rally and raise funds and attempt to acquire these ships. They've given museums the chance to take parts off of these ships. Earlier this year, they took Kitty Hawk into dry dock for the last time and cleaned her bottom. They didn't want any of the marine growth and other organisms from the Bremerton area to then be spread around the world, because she does need to be towed a great distance. Supercarriers don't fit through the Panama Canal, so Kitty Hawk is going to have a dead ship tow start later this year or early next year. That's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks for her to be dragged from Bremerton, Washington, all the way down the west coast of North and South America, through the Straits of Magellan, and then back north up the east coast of South America, through the Caribbean, and to Brownsville, Texas, where she'll be scrapped. While all of this is going on, the folks who are going to do the shipwrecking at the breakers are going to get their security clearance. So in a couple of months after that, Kennedy is then going to be towed from here in Philadelphia down the east coast of the U.S. and to Brownsville, Texas. And then over probably the next 2, maybe 3 years, both of these vessels are going to be cut up like their sister ships before them. All right, so another question we've seen is, why does the Navy have these fundraising requirements for potential museum ships? Why can't they just give it to the first person to come up and ask for it? It sure saves them trouble in having to scrap the ship. Well, this might have been the mindset at one point. Back in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s and 90s, we had the golden age of museum ships, where a number of organizations were able to acquire museum ships. And the requirements for that were much less strict than they are today. Well, these ships represent the U.S. Navy, and if one of these museums fails, then what happens? Either the Navy looks bad because this ship, which is associated with the Navy, starts to rust and look bad, or it gets returned to the Navy, and the Navy now has to go through all of this process again to pay for towing it away, repairing it, doing whatever remediation work needs to be done before it gets taken to its final disposition, which likely would be scrapping at that point. So if you cannot prove to the Navy that you can maintain one of these ships by doing the necessary fundraising up front, then they can't expect that if they give you one of these ships that you'll be able to maintain it. Make no mistake, Kennedy's flight deck is 4.5 acres large. The ship has its own zip code. If you compared Kennedy to USS New Jersey, New Jersey comes out, let's see, nearly 2,500 feet shorter and over around 150 feet narrower. These ships are huge. They displace more than New Jersey. They're longer, they're wider. They had at least twice the crew on board. These ships are huge. If it costs this museum $10,000 a day to maintain New Jersey, what would it cost to maintain a ship even larger than that? So you need an organization that can prove it can do the fundraising. We have seen museum ships fail in the past. The destroyer Edson was returned to the Navy, which was absolutely unheard of. The Navy gave it out to a museum organization. That organization decided they couldn't maintain it, and they gave it back. So then the Navy had to pay for it. And fortunately, another organization stepped up and took her over and is doing a fantastic job operating her these days. But the Navy never expected any of these ships that went to museums to come back. Look at what's happening with the submarine Ling. She did not have the financial support she needed. She had some maintenance issues, and now there's a huge question of what's going to happen with her. There are organizations that are trying to save her so the Navy doesn't have to step in, but the Navy must be terrified that they're going to have to step in and do something about the ship that, as far as they were concerned, was written off. But now they may have to find money in their budget, and they don't have enough money in the budget to build the fleet that they want, much less to help with museum ships. If all these organizations can't save their museum ships, then the Navy has to come in and raise Ling and pay for her to be towed, cleaned up, remediated, and scrapped. The aircraft carrier Cabot, the organization that acquired her, did not acquire her from NAVSEA. They acquired her when she was decommissioned as a Spanish warship. And they did not have the wherewithal to maintain that vessel, and so she eventually had to be towed away and scrapped. So it is not outside the ordinary for these ships to fail as museums. I just saw an article yesterday. The Soviet Foxtrot class submarine that's been in San Diego is going to be sold for scrapping later this year or early next year too. She's deteriorating there. She's a part of a multi-ship organization there at the San Diego Maritime Museum, and she doesn't fit with the rest of their collection. So in order to have the money to maintain their entire collection, they've got to get rid of this ship that they can't preserve. So again, this is not one that came from the Navy, but museum ships are failing, and the ones that NAVSEA administers cannot be allowed to fail, because then they return to the Navy, and the Navy has to find the money to deal with them, and they don't have those resources. So Kitty Hawk and Kennedy cannot be saved, but what is a current active duty Navy ship that you would love to see preserved as a museum in the future? Let us know in the comments section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other public and private institutions, but not the U.S. Navy. If you would like to help support us, there's a link in the description for ways you can. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about our museum and the work we're doing. Thanks for watching.